Okay, so we'll start with just a little overview of what we're going to cover. But maybe just before I do that, and I guess if I have 29 participants in here, barring CBC people, I just kind of get a feeling for, are there mainly developers? Are there, God forbid, any lawyers here? Or what's the general breakdown, do we know at this point? I guess if many of you were in the morning session, you're sort of hardcore developers wanting to develop on Solidity, etc. But do we have a kind of feel for who's in the room? Okay. Quite a spread of skills, which is what I'm expecting. So don't worry, this is not going to be a fully 4 hours of code. This is designed to be kind of a bit of all things to all people. For those who want to get their hands dirty with code, there's plenty of that. We can show you around the different CORDA examples and also the core project. Yeah, keep them coming in there. It is very useful to know who we're chatting to. But the good advantage of the framework that we'll be looking at, so the Accord project, is that there are 3 different levels of abstraction. So we can start to work with, if there's just most of you might be comfortable working in a contract environment, so just the text. Some of you might be a little bit more comfortable drilling down into some executable code. That's fine. The Smart Legal Contract framework we're looking at allows you to kind of write at all 3 levels. So it doesn't mean that one person has to be fluent in all of the different techniques. So I think there'll be something for everybody in this. Also, the more hands-on aspects, we're going to walk through developing a smart legal contract using the Accord project. I did send around a list of prerequisites. Apologies, it was a little squished, I noticed, on the video export, but I'm using a different tool now for that. But don't worry, if you're not comfortable or not willing to install anything on your machine, there are very good web-based tools that the Accord project provides that allow you to play around in an online environment. You can try things out, tweak different contracts, try some different inputs, see the effect on different outputs, etc. So yeah, you can do that without installing anything on your own system. For those that do, once I get into the slides, I have some resources that you might want to get a head start on. So if I'll kind of be sort of setting the scene a little bit for the first while. So if you don't want to just listen to me kind of go through the slides, then you can always feel free to get started with the more technical aspects. So just wondering again, if that's everybody. It's probably about half the group. I've only seen one person claim to be a developer, but any more developers in the house? Don't be shy. If anybody can write something as simple as an Excel function, God forbid, that might get you through quite a bit of the simple examples as to what we're looking at. So don't feel if you've never touched a programming language before, or if you haven't in a long time, or you're always scared of it in school or something, don't worry about it. Yeah, there's plenty of kind of hand-holding along the way. I will have some of my team members hopefully potentially joining as well to help people out, but it's a collaborative group. We want to try and make it a little bit more interactive. What I'd like to get out of this, and hopefully what you'd like to get out of it, is an understanding of how to build these smart legal contracts. What are they? What can they do? How do they differ from blockchain? So you just sat through a Solidity workshop, which is something that we won't be going near today at all, which is why this is a separate session. We won't really be talking about Ethereum, some references to it. We'll be looking at CORDA a little bit later. So we're going to have a look at the broad area. We're going to deep dive into one worked example, basically a late delivery and penalty clause. We're going to look at how that's created. Sorry. And then we're going to modify that and make some changes to it and kind of round trip it. Hopefully that will give everybody time to get set up, that wants to get set up or is able to, because I also recognize that some of you might be, hard to know in a remote working environment at the moment. You might have a laptop that you're not able to install any software on. It might be locked down for security policies, etc. So don't worry, again, those online tools that I mentioned, the Core Template Studio, you can be able to do some of this online without installing any software. But it is sometimes more efficient to have your own environment set up. So there's guides on how to do that for your own environment. I try to be operating system agnostic. At the moment, I'm obviously presenting from a Mac, but most of the Accord project team are kind of split between the two. So there's generally pretty good support for both. However, that does mean that supporting some of the issues you might run into along the way, for example, with even just a Node.js installation on Windows can be difficult. It can also be difficult on Mac as well. And I did mention in the prerequisites that I guess just to clarify, you presume you had to install Node.js if you wanted to participate in the workshop this morning. Maybe somebody can pop that in the chat. But there are sometimes some version differences, and I would recommend a tool called NVM, which allows you to have different versions of Node.js installed on your system, and then you can choose which one you want to execute. So as we get into the more advanced aspects, we may get time to have a look at some Hyperledger Fabric a little bit later, but I know we've been kind of squashed in a little bit to allow people to attend both workshops. But I have plenty of notes on that, even if we don't get to look at it today. And there's some videos online on how to do it as well. But that's where it starts to get a little bit messy around versions, etc., because Hyperledger is a changing platform, and the Accord project is also a changing platform. So, but I do have some guides on that. So where are we going to start with? We're going to start with looking at the overall area of legal smart contracts, and again, where they differ from smart contracts. There will be some discussion around the legalities of this. Caveat that I'm not a lawyer, I'm a technologist. So please don't take what I'm saying as sort of official truth from the lawyers, but I will be showing you what the lawyers are saying about this and recent reports that I've been involved in putting together from a technical perspective, and we'll get into the weeds of it. But this is also designed to be smart contract agnostic. So a smart legal contract doesn't necessarily need a blockchain. It obviously fits quite well into a blockchain, and there are many flavors of blockchain out there. This is not a blockchain talk. You've had one this morning on Ethereum, which is a fine ecosystem, both in private and public Ethereum. I'll be showing you an open source agnostic solution that can work without any blockchain, but can also be deployed alongside or inside various different blockchains. That's why we like it. That's because it's open, and it doesn't bind us into any sort of strawberry flavored Hyperledger or vanilla flavored CORDA, or whatever your flavor of blockchain is. So, but we do recognize that it's more likely to sit alongside other smart contract frameworks or blockchains or DLTs. And again, hopefully people know the difference. So I'll generally use the term DLT because most of what I'm talking about is enterprise distribution. So not necessarily public blockchains, which is probably what you spoke most about this morning, but I'm sure they went into enterprise blockchain or enterprise Ethereum as well. We're going to do a little bit more sort of, not quite design thinking, but thinking about the problems and how would you go about solving it with a smart legal contract. Once we have kind of the basic understanding and building blocks, we're going to take a step back away from the code, and we're going to have a look at something that I've put together specifically actually for this conference. And that's a smart legal contract canvas. If anybody is familiar with something like business model canvas or lean canvas or many of the other canvases that are out there, then it's something I've put together as a very first and rough cut. I did show it to a lawyer, came back with lots of feedback, as you can imagine. So it's not perfect by any means, but I think and hope that people that have seen it have thought it would be very useful in framing the discussion, framing the issues, and trying to get you started in figuring out what can be automated, what can't be automated, and what are the important aspects from that. So we'll do a few exercises around that, see if it's useful. It's a bit of a road test for me, but I hope it will be useful to form some discussion. What we'd love out of this is if you come with your own clauses that are of interest. We'll look at a number of them. We'll obviously increase the complexity as we move through. The Accord project is quite a powerful language, but it also gets a little bit more complex the deeper you get, like anything else. So we're going to start with some of the simple, trivial examples, but then build up the complexity. But we'd love you to bring real-world examples. So we'll be looking at some that we've built, and some that others have built, and in particular EHAB, if they join. I'm not sure if they're here. I could get them to talk through their example a little bit better than I could. I've seen an early version of it, but we can potentially get them to give their feedback on doing this for real. But as I said, they'll be doing a lot more of that tomorrow. We'll talk a little bit about blockchains and oracles. So how do you get external data sources that are trusted? And look at a few real-world use cases where we've been using that, and others are doing similar things. We've produced a paper about it and are keen to collaborate with anybody else who's also interested in working in this space and pulling in external data and getting that processed in a blockchain or in a smart legal agreement. Then we're going to switch away from just pure Accord into a binding into CORDA. So looking at some of the integration with the Accord project and the CORDA. And then we're going to also look at some of the existing CBC projects that are out there. So CBC and Able Gang have been running some hackathons over the last number of years. I think it goes back to what, 2018, Able? I've been able to attend some of them. but I had always sort of been kind of never there to see the results of them, but we're keen to get involved.
So yeah, we had a number of hackathons, mainly on CORDA and Hyperledger, and they were looking to construction contracts and particular things we identify in construction contracts that we would like to automate, things like retentions and also the tendering process.
Okay. So we hope that some of the outcomes from this will be fed back into CBC. Maybe we could set up our own repository for legal smart contracts if that's necessary, or if it's already extending the existing CORDA app, we could look at putting it in there. But either way, we don't care where it goes, but it would be lovely to get that contributed and to really build up that shared knowledge. So everything that I'm presenting is pretty much in the open. If not, it's just because it's a little kind of not quite ready. It's not that it's proprietary or anything. I guess I should do a little bit of background on myself, but before I do that, we're reserving some time at the end to get your feedback, your thoughts. I'm going to be talking for the next few hours. People can be listening or not listening. They might go off and take a clause that they've already been wanting to see if they can automate. It'd be awesome if somebody was able to show, even if it's a canvas or a rough bit of kind of pseudocode of logic, because the smart legal contract language we'll be looking at, Ergo, is a domain-specific language. Nobody here on the call has probably learned it before. It's a bit similar to JavaScript, but we'll get into that. So it doesn't have to be perfect. It's just if you had an idea for even a clause and how you can extract the variables from it, what type might they be, and what would rough logic be to automate part of that contract, or just, let's face it, they're probably on an individual clause level or a couple of clauses that might depend on each other. That would be fantastic. And that's something that you can continue to develop throughout the entire few days. And I think Abel was saying that might be a potential to show that near the end of the conference as well. I'll be around for those couple of days, so it doesn't necessarily stop at 6 o'clock this evening. Of course, normally it would involve going for a few beers afterwards, but unfortunately the situation we're in, that's not an option. But I'm happy to potentially stay on for another few minutes afterwards if people want to discuss things. There's also an upcoming event that I want to mention that would be great if anybody's interested in participating in. But will be breaks in between. I'll need to stop for a little while, and we'll play a few videos, etc. So it's not just going to be me talking. As I said, it's a small enough group, so we want to try and take questions at different points and get some input from you as well. Okay, so we're going to be looking primarily at the Accord project as our smart legal contract framework. There are others that are out there. There's no particular reason I'm not covering them. It's just time, and I'm more familiar with the Accord project. There's another good one out there called Open Law, which is quite tied into the Ethereum ecosystem. So that should be more familiar to you now after your workshop this morning. But we're looking at primarily the Accord project, and there's a number of reasons why we're doing that. One is to remain blockchain agnostic. So we want a system that will work for just contract automation without a blockchain, or a public blockchain or private blockchain. And it's hard to pick winners as well, right? And different vendors use different tools. Everybody's got something to sell. So you can't rely on the customers that you're going to be dealing with working on a blockchain system that only works with your legal infrastructure. The other good reason for using the Accord project, I think that's quite valid, is that it's hopefully going to be part of the BSI standard for implementing smart legal contracts. So it's another good reason to potentially keep an eye on this one, because if this is approved, this will be the standard way of building out these types of things. So we're members alongside Abel and Co. with the real estate and construction working groups. So similar areas, there's a lot of overlap between real estate and construction. There's a lot of sharing of problems in that space. And we'll be outlining some of the work that we've done in both of those groups as well along the way. We're also part of FIBRI, which is more on the real estate side, but they definitely have an interest in a number of areas that relate to construction as well and the built environment. And we held an event, seemed like quite a long time ago at this point. It was last year in the summer, back when we used to do events in person. But we're also planning a new event in November 2020. The one that always seems to be quite popular with people is seems to capture the imagination is real estate tokenization. So if anybody's interested in that, please do contact me afterwards, and we can see if you've got something interesting to contribute. It'd be wonderful to get your input and come along to that event, and we'll be posting more information on that. A little bit about getting started. Again, while I'm talking, you could feel free to visit the Accord project website, and it's pretty self-explanatory where to go from there. If you look at the docs component, there's some getting started installation instructions, and that, if you haven't already done so, will kind of get you started with downloading Node.js if you haven't already, making sure that you've got the right version, and some of the requirements about building these. So don't necessarily wait for me. Please go ahead and have a play around with that. Even if you don't want to install anything and just want to get a little bit familiar with what we're going to be looking at. We do have a video which starts you at that point, which I'm going to get Leo to play so I can catch my breath for a few minutes, but we're not looking at that for a little while. But that will walk you through from an empty installation, how do you get Hello World, the equivalent working inside the Accord project. And then we'll go from there in complexity. What we're going to do after that, we're going to adapt the late delivery and penalty. Again, that's an online tutorial. You can follow along yourselves. If you can get the Hello World working, I would suggest. If you can't get the Hello World working, you're going to have a little bit of difficulty adapting the late delivery and penalty. So just follow along with the tutorials that are there online on the Accord project as well. There are a wealth of existing templates. I'm going to get into this in more detail as to what is inside the Accord project, but feel free to start exploring those. Use those as a way to start thinking about, do any of these clauses match something that you have a real problem with? Or wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a way of automating this particular process that is a nightmare at the moment? And it turns out there might be a clause that's similar in that area. In reality, there probably won't be, because most of you are attending a construction blockchain conference, and many of the sort of solutions that are out there are more in finance, some are in real estate, but we're hoping that will change, and we're hoping events like this will change that. So we're looking in that. I've started to put together some models around this that try and match existing sort of standards in this space, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And people like EHAB, for example, have been working on modeling some of the NEC contracts. And it would be wonderful if we could start to build up a kind of a mapping between concepts that are in, for example, NEC and JCT, and pop those into the public domain, and then people can start reusing those building blocks. So like any software, if you have to write everything from scratch yourself, it's going to take a long time. It's going to lead to a lot of effort, and it's going to be a lot of heartache. But popular programming languages succeed because they're easy to use, they have good documentation, and they have good libraries and a good community. And we're lucky that we're starting to build those libraries in a Accord project. We've got a very good core team. It's expanding, but it's still a small community, and we need more input from individuals. We've Hacktoberfest running at the moment, and we're trying to get people to contribute additional code. It'd be wonderful if we could get some submissions out of this project as well. I think if you make 3 contributions to open source projects as part of Hacktoberfest, if you get a t-shirt or something, which is obviously, you know, ultimate kudos. You can't wear down the pub anymore because probably pubs will be closed. But either way, it'd be wonderful to get contributions for either full-on, unlikely to get a full-on contract. Some of the construction contracts are definitely quite massive, but if we could get a contribution for either some of the clauses or some of the model types behind those clauses, that would be a wonderful start and would make everybody's life a lot easier when making new automated clauses from there. We're going to have a look at this Smart Legal Contract Canvas, as I mentioned, if anybody has used Business Model Canvas. Again, there's a lot in there, probably too much. I'll need to scale it back, but it's a set of kind of thinking points really about what do we need to pop into a smart legal agreement, and getting the kind of thinking cap on around what are the issues, what needs to go into it, how do you get that? Is it the existing system digitized, for example? Many of the problems we run into sometimes when we come with a digital solution to a problem is that some of it is not always digitized. So there's still paper involved, and it's very hard to put paper on a blockchain, as we know at this point. But so it may be that some of the cost benefits from a legal smart contract, or even just a blockchain implementation, can justify the cost of digitizing the process, because you're not going to get very far unless everything is on chain realistically. So we'll be going through this in a little bit more detail, and it'd be wonderful to kind of get people using this, get their feedback, what you found useful, was it useful at all, was it confusing, and we'll try and improve that as a community. I've just literally put this together and thrown out version 0.1. These things normally take a number of iterations before they become useful to people. As I mentioned, EHAB, I'm not sure if they're on here. they were lucky enough to supply a subset of their weather example. So this is a real NEC compensation event. It's definitely in a work in progress. Don't treat this as sort of a finished thing. And Josh and the team, who I've known for a couple of years, will no doubt give their thoughts on this and how practical it was to implement a real world use case for an NEC requirement inside a smart legal agreement. And I believe it's Hyperledger, I think, that they're integrating with for this as well, along with the team at the Digital Catapult, who we also know quite well as part of their DLT field apps. So we're excited about this. This is a real world example. I'll show some of the stuff I've been up to as well, but I think this one is very, very relevant for the construction community and a good starting point. And even their work in this space, if they release those models publicly, and probably have to clean it up a little bit, although I haven't looked at it, so it might be perfect. I only got it from the guys literally a couple of hours ago. But even some of those concepts that are there would be very useful for other people to build on. But this is a real world example, and I think it's showing how while there's a lag in adoption and people are trying out proof of concepts, this is becoming more mature and people are now starting to use it for real world use. We'll also have a look a little bit later at the Accord project and how it integrates with CORDA. So this is, again, this binding between quite a well-known and well-deployed DLT solution. So it's not a public blockchain, as some of you are aware. It's mainly used in finance, actually. So banking is the kind of core base for CORDA, but it's quite scalable and has a number of benefits around transaction privacy, while still allowing people like regulators. So I guess in a construction environment, it might allow two parties to contract without everybody seeing what's going on, but also maybe somebody who needs to have oversight, for example, can validate that things are being done according to the regulations, etc. So I have a little video about that, and there's also a little bit more on the CORDA website, but that's coming a little bit later. So why are we interested in this space? So we're starting to see distributed ledger technologies and legal engineering becoming more of a well-known and well sought after discipline. So traditionally the legal industry, and I can say this working for a law firm, I never thought I'd be working for a law firm. I'm only there probably about a year and a half ago, actually. No, sorry. Yeah, about 2 years ago, actually, but by the time I started getting involved, I got involved on the basis of seeing the Accord project and kind of thinking, oh, the legal industry is really slow to move. But now I'm starting to see that that's in fact changing, and it's really starting to wake up and see the opportunities for contract automation, for distributed ledger technologies, things like cryptocurrencies and assets like that are changing the way that some of the systems work. In reality, some of it changes quickly, some of it doesn't. The legal issues are still issues, and they need to keep up with the pace of development. But within industry, we're starting to see distributed ledger technologies solving some problems around, for example, supply chain and traceability, provenance of materials, etc., and tracking payments as well. So smart legal contracts the concept is actually not that new. It goes back a number of years, but really it's found a new life really in trying to execute inside the concept of a trusted immutable ledger. So if you can track all of the events, then you have traceability all the way through, so that you know that when a clause is executed on a contract, you have that proof of this is the set of events that happened to arrive at this decision. So if the contract is just getting arbitrary input in, then anybody can say whatever they want. So having that trust network around the legal agreement is actually key. So blockchain is really the key to enabling this. But it doesn't sit alone. There are other systems that are out there, ERP systems, BIM, and I'm sure Abel is probably going to talk a little bit more about how BIM and blockchain can work together, and finance, as we've discussed as well. It's all about the money, right? So we're not necessarily talking about crypto assets. When many people think of blockchain solving finance problems, it doesn't have to be a token. It doesn't have to be some ERC20 token, which you probably learned about this morning. It can unlock traditional fiat payments as well. It's just ensuring that the right people get paid the right amount of money in a timely fashion. So the legal process is actually the bit that can span all of this. So sometimes you can have great technical infrastructure, but the key difference here is that does it match the legal agreements that are in place? How do you know that the regulations have been followed? How do you know that you're not violating an agreement between two parties that's already been agreed? Because the lawyers know one thing, but the people who are implementing the software sometimes are not really au fait with the complexities of what they've signed up to do, and sometimes the software is not that flexible. So this is really the focus of what we're going to look at. So starting a little bit with smart contracts, this is not as talk about what is a smart contract, what is a blockchain. Not doing that, there'll be enough of that. But this is a commonly asked question around what is the status of DLT and smart contracts, etc. Well, thankfully, there's been a number of things that have happened in the last, say, 6 months or so, actually a little bit longer. It was back into 2019. 2020 is a bit of a write-off at the moment, so it's kind of hard to think what type of the year we are. But this was the Law Tech Delivery Panel, who had a public consultation, and they've produced a report which indicates 2 key things. One is around cryptocurrencies being property, which we're not going to talk about today. I'm not going to talk about crypto assets, but they can be bought, sold, stolen, given in a divorce, etc. But also the other part of this announcement that was of use was the status of smart contracts. So we'll get on to that. I could jump ahead actually to smart contracts first and then come back to legal smart contracts. And the thing about smart contracts is they're not smart and they're not contracts in the legal sense, and they're not smart. They just do what the code tells them to do based on the inputs that they get. You probably looked a lot of where they don't do even what you think they might do. For example, there's been a lot of high-profile Ethereum issues that have happened with immutable contracts that are out there and people firing off destroy events, etc., that didn't think they were able to do, or some of the re-entrant issues that were there as well. So you probably went through a lot of that this morning. And Ethereum is obviously not the only one at fault here, or the author of the smart contract, or whoever you want to blame. And blame is a big thing when it comes to liability. But every smart contract framework out there will have some issues. The only difference, I guess, with some of the DLT solutions is it's easier to fix. If you find an issue, it's not a public blockchain that isn't immutable. In some cases, you can upgrade the network. In some cases, you have to. So you can get money back, etc., where you can't always do that in a public chain unless you have things like the DAO fork and all that stuff that I guess was mentioned this morning. So they're self-executing, but not self-enforcing. So we recommend that there's a legal wrapper alongside the smart contract to govern basically how it works with the existing legal solution. So smart contracts enforceability, yes, it is getting to the stage where they are capable of being enforced. So a legal agreement, this guidance that was there starts to look at an agreement as an agreement, whether it's a verbal agreement or whether it's enforced in code. There's a lot of case law that still needs to build up around this, but it's certainly heading in that direction. It's very clear that can the contractual obligations be defined by reference to computer code? This is where we get into this gray area between what's automatable and what's not, and how well can you automate these individual clauses. So it's still a murky area, it's still a little bit gray. This relates to English law. This does not necessarily apply to other jurisdictions. So it's not one size fits all solution across the globe. There's a lot of jurisdictional issues, enforcement issues, regulatory issues, KYC, AML, all these things that we run into when we start to build global systems, things like dispute resolutions, etc. All that stuff that is already there with blockchain, but we're going to have a look at how you can start to address some of the legal aspects by having legal smart contracts instead. So what is a legal smart contract? So it's a computable legal document. Again, your CORD project is trying to be the BSI standard for this. It's capable of being, in this case, the CORD project at least, deployed on a number of DLT solutions. Current status, the Ethereum, I need to check with the guys at Clause who maintain that. I've been mainly working with Hyperledger and CORDA. With the CORD project, I've built stuff in Ethereum before, but not a CORD project on Ethereum because it doesn't deploy inside a Solidity environment, for example. As you probably realized from the workshop this morning, it's quite limited in what you can do in Solidity, and you don't want to do too much on chain. Yeah, there's a lot of restrictions there. So it abstracts the legal agreement. Executable clauses are contained within the agreement. And we'll have a look at that. So we'll have a look at a real world contract where some of the contract is automatable, some of it isn't. And then we'll have a look at what goes into a clause and what can come outside of a clause as well. So really the key difference here is the binding between an existing legal agreement between parties and what is actually executable and potentially on a blockchain, or sending events to a blockchain and receiving events from a blockchain. We won't go through all this, but there's various different standards bodies that are trying to standardize stuff in this space around blockchain. Kind of mentioned this in the past. So a smart legal contract is human readable and machine readable. That's the key thing. A human can understand it, but also a machine can understand it. So we're not talking about a situation of natural language understanding where a machine can read the actual contract and turn that magically into code. It would be wonderful if we were at that point, but we're not there yet. And I think it's fair to say that we may not be there anytime soon. So it's we do quite a bit actually at Mishcon with natural language processing, particularly in the legal space, but in others as well, and some of the DLT space, both sort of from an academic perspective. So myself and a lot of the team are also academics at UCL in the School of Management, and also help out in computer science. We're members of the Construction Blockchain Consortium, but we also have a sort of machine learning background, and particularly looking at natural language processing. But I think we're starting to see some companies trying to do this, and it has been tried in the past, but mapping that legalese effectively into code is quite a difficult task. So the Accord project doesn't try to do that. It tries to have abstraction layers, and we'll see the difference and how that works. And there's value to be added at each layer from there, even without executing the code. Just having the concepts of a contract be able to be computed is useful. Let's start with a practical example. So this is a loan example. So a fixed rate loan. So this is a fixed interest. So the stars that are there is not code or anything. This is Markdown. If anybody's familiar with Markdown, maybe if you've edited a GitHub or anything on GitHub, or maybe some CMS solutions that are out there, the stars are some formatting that comes out there. But when you start to see these curly braces, this is a variable. Okay, so this is something that is going to be turned into some kind of, in this case, a loan amount. So I imagine it's a currency and a rate. Sorry, well, an amount. So a fixed amount of money in this particular case. So it can apply a currency and also a value. We have an interest rate in there. We've got a duration. So the duration is probably a multiple of hours, days, months, years. And we have those kind of concepts in the Accord project as well. So loan duration and monthly payments. So this is a more real world example. This is what we mean by starting with the legalese, starting with the legal document, and trying to abstract from there some values that are inside in that contract, and trying to then further extrapolate that into a function that can compute this type of clause. So it's a fixed interest loan. So loan is a certain amount at a particular interest rate for a particular duration. And then what should your monthly payments be on that? It doesn't describe what happens if you don't meet one of those payments. There would be other clauses, presumably later in the contract, that will deal with that. But this is just figuring out what your fixed interest repayments potentially might be. So you start to build up these units of computation. One can figure out what the monthly payment should be, so everybody knows what they're signing up for. And then others can start to figure out, well, what happens if somebody doesn't pay, or doesn't pay the required amount, or is late. So and so on. And we'll be looking at other examples of that. As I mentioned, there are ERP systems and all kinds of external things that these systems need to interoperate with. So blockchain is only, in some cases, one part of the problem. But first of all, you've got to draft a contract, and the lawyers have different tools for using that than developers. And then somehow you've got to capture, first of all, even signing a contract is a tricky thing. Sometimes it's, in many cases, still paper-based. Thankfully, a lot of firms are starting to embrace things like DocuSign and other solutions for electronically signing documents, but that's not even prevalent. And that goes back to the putting paper on a blockchain problem that we have in practice. Thankfully, even things like COVID-19 have helped with this, from KYC and anti-money laundering, identification of people being done electronically using apps, and verification of people's faces, just kind of stuff anybody into cryptocurrency would take for granted. But in many cases, the legal industry has been a bit slow, not just the legal industry, but it has to sit inside a business environment. So you have to kind of understand that blockchain is only part of the solution. A smart legal contract is only part of the solution. You've got to understand what is the surrounding environment, because otherwise you might only be automating a tiny little part of the flow that might not be adding value. And that's something we can come back to when we look at the smart legal contract canvas. But typically, the contract might compute, does somebody owe somebody else? Is there a breach? Is there force majeure? And then it will start to emit events, which will then be handled in different ways. So that could be put on a blockchain. It could generate an email. It could automatically make a payment to somebody's bank account. It can listen for incoming events from a bank account via payment APIs, for example, Stripe. So it can start to see that party A owes party B a fixed amount of money. When is this due by? And then you can check a little bit later, well, it's 30 days later now, did somebody pay? If they didn't pay, maybe there's an interest that's accrued, etc. So this kind of external world is quite relevant when it comes back to oracles, as I mentioned. So how do we get data in and out of the legal agreement is crucial. So it doesn't sit in isolation. Mentioned this one as well. The only thing that I'd add here is IoT sensors, payment providers, external data feeds, as I mentioned. External data feeds is one we'll come back to when we start to look at oracles. For example, if you're trying to figure out interest rates or currency prices, or whether that's fiat currency or crypto prices, if it's betting use case, sometimes you need to talk to the outside world. In the EHAB case, for the weather example, it's actually a little bit more local. The external world means the construction site, what's going on at that construction site at a very local level. What's the weather at that point? Is it raining right there? Or is it like it is here at 37 degrees at the moment and roasting? So does that mean it's too hot? There are construction people outside, which is also a potential risk for me at the moment. They seem to be quite quiet today because I did ask. But is it too hot for them to work? Definitely not here. But again, sometimes you need this external trusted information to start to make these computations with the contract. So definitely, this hopefully will lead to improved guidance and clarity and a better understanding of potential liabilities and fewer legal disputes, hopefully. And where disputes do actually occur, it makes the process a little bit more painless, hopefully, because it will have a digitized background of all of the events that have happened. That doesn't necessarily need to be in the smart legal contract. That can come from just having a blockchain or any, say, automated solution, non-paper. But the smart legal contract can obviously help with ensuring that what came from the parties, did they do what they were supposed to do, etc. So having this additional digitization can be helpful. So we're going to start to get into the weeds a little bit on how you build a smart legal contract. But before I do that, I was going to stop and kind of come up for air and pause for any questions that anybody has. So I can't see in this view too easily if people are asking questions or not. So feel free to stop me at any point, Egil or Leo, if you want to kind of bring anything to my attention. So this is the first time I've had a look at the list of attendees, actually, a few familiar names in there. But yes, has anybody any burning questions at this point?
We've got a couple in the chat box.
Okay, I cannot find that too easily at the moment.
I can read them out, don't worry. It's from Sagar Road. Why smart contracts are not a contract, and for any wrong operation, parties can sue each other, so smart contracts should be contracts.
Well, I guess, yeah, the standard kind of things that come inside there. The thing is, it's easier to sue somebody if you sue them not for what's on a blockchain, you sue them for breaking a legal agreement. So if you're talking about two different languages, then the lawyers are ultimately going to ask, well, it doesn't matter what the blockchain says, what did they agree to? And the blockchain should back that up. But the closer the alignment between the legal agreement and what was actually agreed is deployed into code using the same language, and it makes things an awful lot easier to understand and to map back in. So you lose that kind of level of, we call kind of switching, where somebody moves on one side, does the legal agreement and hands over and then types in the contents of that legal agreement into a system. Maybe something gets mistyped, for example, or the validation logic of a programmer trying to implement the legal clause and is not a lawyer, doesn't do it according to the right construct. There's many things that can go wrong about miskeying and that. So the validation aspects, which we'll look at a little bit later, are also a little bit clearer in this particular domain-specific language, which reasons about clauses, etc. So it is part of a blockchain solution, I would say, in that sense. So the smart contract solution can be far broader than a legal smart contract. I don't think you'd have a system where it's just a legal smart contract. It wouldn't be kind of very useful. A legal smart contract needs data that is from transactions, etc. So in many cases, it can sit alongside that, but the core business logic, if you like, of the legal agreement, if that's used in a legal smart contract fashion. And that could be, for example, written in a CORD and then cross-compiled into Java, which is how it happens on the CORDA example. Then you arrive with Java that is effectively compliant with the legal agreement. So that makes things an awful lot easier. It is a bit of it's a tricky one. And it's not an unusual question. Sorry, I'm not sure that kind of answers both questions. What was the first one again?
The first one is why I think it was connected.
Yeah.
So just trying to equate smart contracts to
I can see that.
It is an interesting thing, actually, because in this white paper that the CBC has been writing on construction cash flow, one of the big considerations is the way that smart contracts fit into the existing legal frameworks and so on. And they're having to be both technical and legal workarounds in the immediate, but then trying to create kind of a connection or changes in policy that will accommodate for smart contracts existing in construction. So very interesting. We have another question. Does blockchain require payments in digital currency like Bitcoin, or any conventional hard cash transactions can be traded using smart contracts? Yeah,
so maybe I need to elaborate on that a bit more. If you take a smart legal contract, so something that we were looking at here in the Accord project, then you can actually deploy it completely independent of a blockchain, and you can have payments being triggered. So a clause provides a solution beyond the kind of open source piece. And other providers are coming as well. It's not just clause in this space, although they were the main ones who kind of started the project. So their solution, for example, allows more external connectivity. So they have an integration with Stripe, and Stripe can monitor for bank payments. So yes, it could be completely fiat. Most of the uses that I see here are, and same with the land registry project, which we'll talk about a little bit later, which is the digital streets. Yes, houses can be bought with Bitcoin. They were bought, I think it was 2017 was the first one in the UK. But no, you don't need to have things locked in so that it has to be a cryptocurrency transaction for any of this to work. So in reality, I think most of this stuff will still work with hard cash, or at least in electronic form through a bank account, rather than raw cash transactions. But yeah, none of this necessarily requires cryptocurrency. And are these legal contracts recognized by governments and law in general? Again, very difficult to say, depends on the jurisdiction. And again, not a lawyer, but if you read through some of the guidance that I've put out there, it's certainly moving in that direction. So English law is quite flexible in this regard as to what can be considered a contract, even a verbal agreement, once there's a certain set of, like it must be a consideration. So there has to be some exchange of value. So something has to be paid, even if it's a token amount. So token being used in a different context this time, not a cryptocurrency, but it could be a cryptocurrency. But even these kind of things where we've seen in the past, you know, you must pay £1 to the other party or something. So there has to be an exchange of value for it to be considered any kind of binding contract. How secure are smart legal contracts? That is a very good question. If you're reducing human oversight and contract administration, are you more exposed for auto-enacting clauses payments incorrectly? Yes. If a human does something wrong, they might do it wrong once, and you might catch it quickly enough. If the code is wrong, every time you execute it, you're going to get the wrong answer. Unless obviously there's race conditions where sometimes it only produces the wrong answer at different points, and there's that old adage of garbage in, garbage out. So if the contract acts on the wrong inputs, then it's going to give you the wrong output. So yes, testing is crucial for all this. And one of the kind of sections on the smart legal contract canvas there is all around how do you test this kind of stuff. And one of the aspects as to why this is quite good is the language that we're using is a functional language. So the Ergo language is actually relatively easy to test. It's trying to avoid stateful interactions, or where it is the state is quite clear. So trying to avoid side effects. So it should be very clear. We generally don't allow any new clauses to be added to the repository unless it has a solid set of unit tests and at least a second pair of eyes or maybe more on it. Is there an option for a kill switch if it all goes haywire? Yes and no. It depends on how this is deployed. For example, if this was deployed hypothetically in a public blockchain environment, and let's say you're able to embed the legal agreement inside something like Ethereum, there's no kill switch on Ethereum, is it? So in that example, it will continue to run forever, just like it would with a regular smart contract on a public network. Is there a kill switch on a private network? Yes, you can turn things off, you can patch, you can redo transactions, etc. So yeah, it's a little bit more easy to control in that sense. And one of the key things actually have in the smart contract canvas as well is around what happens with upgrades, what happens when legislation changes. So your contract might change for various different reasons, external events, COVID, for example. There's all kinds of force majeure that can happen. In this particular case, how do we deal with those events? Well, we've got to upgrade the contract. You've got to be able to save the state of the contract and load it back in. And for any of you who are kind of going ahead and playing with some of the CORDA projects that are there, you will see that it's quite easy to do that. The output of every interaction is a state. The input into the next interaction is what is the current state. That state can be stored in a file, it can be stored in a database, it can be stored in public ledger, it can be stored in a private blockchain. So for example, in that particular case, you could take the contract down, tweak it because something wasn't performing as expected, load it back up, and then resume the state, provided that the parties have now agreed to that new contract. So it's kind of like we're not starting from point zero, we're starting from a new contract, and this is the existing state. So yeah, you do have that power with this. How far away are we from a fully coded NEC contract? We are very far away from that, but we would like to get closer. So I'm hoping some of the outputs from this might be to look at some of the NEC or JCT clauses that are there and trying to see, can we make an approximation of what they might look like. So hopefully that's what you might work on. As Abel popped in the chat, start thinking about clauses that are close to your heart or ones that you hate and how easy your life might be if, for example, some of those were automated. What arbitration bodies governs disputes with smart contracts? I have a slide on that a little bit later. Any New York conventions agreed for arbitration blockchain or the use of smart contracts? I don't know specifically for New York. Actually, Mishcon used to have an office in New York, not anymore. Open up in Singapore instead. But again, I do know two people in our group who would be able to answer that. So Anne Rose or Tom Grogan from our team would be able to answer that specifically. However, I would say that actually also some of the team from the Accord project are also based in New York. In fact, the core development team are based in New York. But I will say that there are some arbitration bodies that are out there that are doing on-chain dispute resolution. One that I thought was doing it was Materium. But when I looked at it now, I think they moved away from that and they're just tracking physical items. I know that William Shatner is part of the board and they're starting with Star Trek memorabilia, etc. So I don't know if they do the dispute resolution anymore, but there are two that I'll mention, Kaleido and Jur. And that's exactly what they're looking at doing around dispute resolution, either distributed juries or looking at different arbitration processes. And for Jur in particular, I know that they have a number of global hubs. In fact, we're going to be involved in the London hub. And so they will have other hubs. I'm not sure if it's New York specific, maybe it could be Delaware. I don't know where in the US, but they will have some global distributed network of offices. Are government legal bodies considering running nodes? Yes. So we had a proof of concept with the land registry in the UK, where they ran a CORDA network and they had a hackathon. We were involved in the hackathon and started to look at some of the logic that was there around the transactions, and it was missing a piece around the legal aspects. So yes, we did a proof of concept with them involving some Accord logic, which I'll talk about a little bit later. They ran the nodes, so we all ran a node each. We were a conveyancer in the process. There was a real replaying of an existing transaction. So there was a house that had already been bought, but it was just replaying the existing transaction effectively. So real transaction, real buyer, real seller, but far more efficient. And we walked through, so I actually have a diagram on it a little bit later, but the land registry also were the core node in that. So they saw all of the transactions from all of the parties, where if you're a buyer's conveyancer and a seller's conveyancer, you just really want to see the transactions that relate to yourself, not to all of your competition. So that's one of the advantages for solutions like CORDA and others, where you can have these transaction privacy sort of situations where you can't on other frameworks. Obviously, you can with things like differential privacy and so on, but still early days on that. So yes, government bodies definitely interested. Other land registries are keen. We have spoken to other government organizations around the world, and they're keen to kind of progress this a little bit further and start to roll out their own nodes, especially in the view that where regulators set the regulations by defining this. And one of the other sort of smart legal contract solutions that's out there called DAML, D-A-M-L. Kieran McGonigal had a pretty good talk about this at the Accord Project Forum, and he was also a contributor to the recent report, one of which was mentioned there from Tech London Advocates Legal and Blockchain Regulatory Group. We had inputs from myself, from Kieran's group, and also from Open Law. And in particular with DAML, one of the advantages for having the kind of contractual clauses implemented in code is that everybody runs the same code. The regulators can validate that it works. And then it's not everybody trying to do their own implementation of a particular financial calculation. For example, if somebody does it a little bit differently, everybody wastes time doing the same thing. Not everybody does it right. And then the regulators can ensure from an audit perspective that the right code is being run and the right input will lead to the right output. So there's obviously a lot of value in agreeing this. And the lawyers will be able to validate that the right legal agreements and regulation is in place. Difference between hard and soft smart contracts. I'm not sure if I follow specifically what your definition is on that. I guess if you mean paper, will you differentiate between hard and soft smart contracts? Well, for an example, if you take an existing legal agreement that's scanned PDF, is something that we're looking at the moment. Some of my team are on the call here. We know this problem quite well. Of taking existing legal agreement that was not necessarily digitized. Yes, you can extract from PDF into text. That is not always as easy as it sounds, even with modern tools. But the Accord project also has another subcategory, which is looking at doing this. I don't think I mentioned it in the slides, but this is a PDF parse library that tries to take an existing contract and look at the spacing that's in there and the indentations and try to map that to a set of clauses. So that will save you going back to scratch and trying to open up an editor and trying to implement these legal agreements from each clause up. So can we bootstrap it with an existing contract? Yes, that's what we're trying to do with the PDF integration piece. You can't. The problem at that point is you have maybe a wet signature on the hard copy of the document, but then how do both parties agree that this online contract should be in place? So really, it should be taking an existing agreement, both parties sign and agree, yes, this is what we agreed. We've already agreed it on paper, but we both need to agree now that it represents our existing agreement. Nothing has changed. We're both happy with it. And then it can be deployed. And then we can both make sure that in an automated fashion, everybody's paying on time and all of the conditions that can be automated and tracked are actually being fulfilled. So yes, there will be a jump between that. So the soft contract should be a subset of the hard contract in that case. So still have that legal document, maybe a paper copy of it, but you now have an electronic version of it that's capable of self-execution. When we reinstall the smart contract, if by then asset transfer has already happened wrongly, can we revert it? This is something that is in an early stage, I would say. So at the moment, it will track what, again, garbage in, garbage out. So if a clause has been told something has happened, it will execute as if something has happened. If you therefore need a compensating transaction. So it normally happens in the case where maybe an event didn't arrive on time. Let's say, for example, if it's an external data feed and there's a problem and one of the Oracle providers went down, which has happened. Sometimes you don't get the result of a football game or something, and then somebody's wondering, well, who pays out on this bet? This is a smart contract problem in general. In many cases, you can't revert that. In some cases, if it's time-based on Ethereum, so tough luck. But in the smart legal agreement, I said that there is a concept of state. So you could always go back and recreate a specific state, but both parties would definitely need to agree to that. It's not something that would happen automatically or unilaterally. It hasn't really become an issue yet because we're still in the early stages of it, but it's definitely something that needs to be considered in the context of these real world things. Bad things happen. Okay, it's a utopia. I think that these things run without any issues. Even the CORDA nodes we were running as well, it's still software. It's running in a VM on Amazon. These things happen. EC2 instances die. There are outages. There are networking issues. There's all kinds of stuff that happens. And sometimes there's a delay in these things happening. Sometimes when you bring systems back up, suddenly 2 events will come through. That may affect the life cycle. It may not. Somebody sending the wrong transaction or duplicate transaction is a real problem. So just like it happens in the real world, having that ability to kind of fix that does open up some interesting issues. So I think much like the result of arbitration or dispute resolution, I would think that there might be a role for maybe trusted parties like law firms, for example, to be to have a manual oracle role where whatever has to be reverted can be then signed and sent back in on the network, and both parties and their counsel effectively would agree this is the new state, undoing what should have been there in the past. It doesn't delete it. Most of these blockchains, it's not an undo operation. It's not a transaction revert, or as it would be in a database. You will still see the old value. It's just that you will now see that it was a new value that compensated for that in the future. Strong and weak smart contracts. Again, that one, I thought you meant hardened. And that one, smart and weak, I need to check specifically what you mean on that. And yeah, that's what I mean, a manual oracle. But again, an oracle is a trusted source of information. We'll get to that, or maybe not, at the pace we're going. But you really need to trust that. Do you want to ensure that it's just one data source? Has that data source got a skin in the game? Have they got a reason to give an incorrect answer, for example? Once smart contracts are implemented, what are the methods to amend some clauses in smart contracts if parties didn't agree, since blockchain won't allow to modify the recorded transactions? So complicated question because it depends on what blockchain. So as I said, and this is more smart contracts than legal smart contracts. So I'm kind of specific to legal smart contracts in this area because smart contracts vary on X flavor of blockchain, Y flavor of blockchain. Some can be amended, some can't. So to give a general answer to that is actually quite complicated because yes, you're right, blockchains won't allow to modify the recorded transactions. They are append only. So it's never a situation where you can go back really and undo it. It can be done in private consortia where everybody has to go and reset their database back to a kind of a previous version, but like a manual backup. Or if you've seen what happened in Ethereum with the DAO exploit, and there was a fork. So it went back to a period in time, but it went back to a period in time and then forked from there. It never went back and changed that transaction. You can't do it. Okay. There are ways to do it. 51% tax, for example, on public networks. I don't know if that was mentioned this morning, but after that fork, the classic Ethereum has been changed a few times. I think it was like 3 times in a month last month. So yes, I think these things do break down, unfortunately, sometimes. Okay, that was a quick blast, but I expected quite a few questions in there. What I think might make sense to do at this point is to get people a little bit more hands-on. So what's on the slide in the background is an example of an Accord project. So this is a clause model and a contract. Has anybody at this stage started to try and play with the Accord project tutorials that are up there? Maybe if you could send a message in the text or in the chat, that would be kind of useful. Just check my own messages here to make sure nobody's saying they can't hear me or anything. All seems good. So yeah, I think it might be good to get a little bit hands-on. So we will be walking through some of this a little bit later. Not yet, been keenly listening. Well, that's good. At least if I'm not boring you, then it's a good start. Sorry, just choking here on water. We'll be diving a little bit deeper into the legal contract stack. So what is Cicero, Concerto, and Ergo? I've mentioned them a little bit, but we will have a bit more of a deep dive into these 3 stages of building a contract a little bit later. I'll skip over some of the less important stuff that may be important for other people, but we can't do everything. So we're part of, I mentioned, the real estate group. Why? Well, we see this as being the future for what we're doing. We've been contributing some clauses, mainly in real estate, as I said, as part of the land registry project that we did as part of Digital Streets, and also in the construction sector, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. And we also did some stuff in the insurance space around adapting contracts based on COVID-19. There's a lot of interesting legal precedent happening at the moment around business interruption insurance, for example, and people, certain large insurance providers saying that COVID was not something that they had to pay out on, and a lot of small businesses saying, well, hang on, I did get the pandemic insurance policy option. So there's various different aspects to that. It's a complicated area and a lot of money at stake, as you might imagine. But we've been working a little bit around COVID data sources and what restrictions are in place and how bad is it in your area. And unfortunately, when we were writing this back in March, lockdowns in the UK at least happened around then. We kind of thought by the time this is all finished, maybe it won't be that relevant. But as we see now, a lot of localized lockdowns happening all around the world, in the UK specifically as well, where your conditions of sale, for example, if you're a restaurant or a pub, your ability to trade has been impacted by COVID in your specific area. So it opens up a whole new world for computable contracts that are based on legislation. So it sort of is becoming far more relevant rather than just a blanket that applies to everybody. I did mention this. We can go through it in a little bit more detail. If anybody is interested, we wrote a white paper with the Land Registry as part of UCL Centre for Blockchain Technology not that long ago. As Abel mentioned, we're also trying to help to write this other one for the, I'm trying to remember the exact title for it, Abel, at this stage. Help me out here, the All Parliamentary Group, but maybe you can pop it into the chat. Maybe Abel, I guess, is quite busy at the moment, running around.
You mean for the construction cash flow white paper?
That's the one.
Yeah.
So,
So it's been developed by our procurement working group at the CBC, and we're hoping to launch it tomorrow, making some final amendments, but it's ready to go with the executive summaries and so on. And we're hoping in due course, as you say, to present this to the all-party parliamentary group on blockchain.
Fantastic. Yeah, turns out it was in my next slide. So there you go.
Nice.
Yeah, I'd forgotten the name, but we won't go through this. We can look at it in more detail on CORDA, but we're involved in that land registry project. I have a link to a video that explains it in a lot of depth as to what we actually did, but it's a practical example of multiple parties coming together. There is a legal agreement that needs to be fulfilled as well. In reality, the legal aspect of this was quite light touch. It was a proof of concept, but there is an existing body of CORDA code that goes through this workflow. And we can delve in a little bit more into the CORDA aspects of this a little bit later. But as a worked example, it's not the worst one. So as a result of that, we looked at the standard conditions of sale. If any of you have tried to buy or sell a house in the UK, you might be familiar with this wonderful document. We tried to just take one clause from that, which was a problem where if you don't complete by 2 p.m., there are serious financial aspects of which one of my colleagues is well aware of at the moment, because they're buying a house and to rush to get everything completed by 2 p.m. And this has been a sort of, it may not be 2 p.m., which can also change things as well if the contract is amended, for example, if there's a chain, but we won't get into the specifics of it. So we just took this specific clause and then tried to modify it. So we can show you where we got to with that. But in order to do that, we had to look at what were the key clauses for the contract, what were the executable portions of that, how did they relate to each other, did they share any data, and then figure out what the late penalty calculation looked like, and determine the amount of compensation, which was dependent on how many days that you were late in moving in or paying your money, etc. And of course, this is a real estate example, but the same kind of thing happens in so many other domains, also in construction. Even more complicated in construction because you've got not just one payment, but you've got interim payments, etc. And then it's always an interesting discussion around, well, was something done on time? Yes, but was it done to a particular standards, and is everybody happy with the work? And then finally, can you release the payment? And then the payment might be via a third party. So actually one thing we did do, just jumping back up here on the Digital Streets example, we have a where is it? Shield Pay is over on the right, is an escrow provider. So there are a number of these companies out there doing online escrow services. So they effectively hold the money in that sense. So you can do that kind of stuff, which I know is you know, the role of a surety, etc., inside a construction contract. So it's one of the main advantages for this. Won't go through it in detail, but we did some Accord contracts, and we'll get into the details of the syntax, etc., in a little bit. Lots of benefits for it. We were speaking to Land Registry again very recently, and they're keen to keep going on this and trying to digitize. They have a serious digitization issue with like a marathon, literally 26 miles worth of paper around their offices, so that they have a long way to go of just digitizing what they do. But they're interested in opening up new use cases such as fractional ownership and tokenization. And even though that sounds like it's not relevant inside construction, it is. It can be new business models for leasing versus selling products, or changing things from being capital expenditure to operational costs, etc., or tokenizing the cost of construction projects. There's lots of stuff that can happen in that space, but you can only do it if you have an asset at that point. Under the construction working group, well, obviously CBC is leading the way on this, and we have some pretty good blockchain and built environment reports that are out there, probably a few more, and obviously the white paper that's coming together is will be a very valuable resource in that space. We had a look at some steel contracts with a proof of concept we were looking at with Arup, where we were trying to mark up this steelwork specification. So again, trying to build that library of existing types and models that are in place for other people to use. We only really got kind of scratched the surface on it, but we're happy to potentially progress that with other people if you're interested as well. So we're conscious that standards do exist already. We just haven't mapped them necessarily to our particular flavor of blockchain or to the Accord project. So there are other RIC standards. They do have schemas that are there in XML and JSON. And I think it would be a useful exercise to start looking at those schemas and seeing, can we map them into an environment that can be used inside a smart legal contract? Because they're already defined, they're well defined in certain cases. So that could be a good starting point for these types of contracts that you might want to create. Dispute resolution already come up, as I mentioned. This paper I spotted is quite recent, The Governance of Blockchain Dispute Resolution. I spotted it, I have not read it. So disclaimer on that one, might not be that good, but it sounds good. But I guess given the title, Harvard Negotiation Law, I guess that might answer some of those questions about the New York jurisdiction as well. But there are some online dispute resolution platforms that I mentioned, Jur and Kleros. So definitely, as I said, Jur has a London node, but I presume it has other nodes as well. And Kleros, I honestly cannot remember. Oracles, we're going to talk a little bit later, because I'm going to stop talking for a while, and or a virtual me may start talking, and we can start with a worked example of building up those projects. Just to mention, on the Oracle side of things, we have a white paper that we wrote, and we're keen to contribute with others who are interested in having new data sources. The COVID-19 example is what we were looking at, but we're looking at real estate also as well, but getting more and more external data on chain and trusted and used inside smart contracts and smart legal contracts. And an example of that is the weather compensation, as I mentioned, from EHAB. So I'm going to stop at this point and take a couple more questions before we jump into looking at the anatomy of a smart contract in a bit more detail. That's if there are any. Okay, right, well, in that case, I might jump into, feel free to take a break anytime. Actually, let's maybe take a 5-minute break. We'll swap over presentations here, and I was going to go through the Accord project in more detail, and we can start to look at the implementation of a smart agreement using the constructs that they have. And yeah, we can catch a quick breather.